So many people think that breastplates are both more expensive and heavier than armour like brigandine. And that's the reason why armour like this brigandine here was preferred by archers and billmen and halberdiers and soldiers, common soldiers, rather than knightly cuirasses or breastplates. But in fact, by the time we get to the early 15th century, the breastplate here, the humble breastplate, doesn't necessarily need to be either heavy or expensive. And conversely, brigandines can be incredibly high quality and high status, so much so that sometimes kings and dukes and great lords and magnates chose on campaign to switch to wearing a brigandine instead of a cuirass for particular tactical reasons. And meanwhile, if we go to the Holy Roman Empire in what's now what we call Germany and places like Bohemia and parts of Poland, we see plenty of breastplates and frontal cuirasses being worn by the most lowly common soldiers, pikemen and halberdiers and gunners and crossbowmen and people like this. And moreover, we see a complete lack, or an almost complete lack, of brigandines in that area. While it's true to say that common soldiers in places like England and France and Italy did often wear brigandine and didn't very often wear cuirasses, why was that the opposite in what's now called Germany? So let's consider why you might choose brigandine or breastplate for the common soldier. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this brigandine, first of all we should mention, would not normally be worn alone. They could be, but they usually be worn over a mail shirt. And we'd say that that's generally speaking true of breastplates and cuirasses as well. Certainly in the early 15th century and for a lot of the rest of the 15th century, either of these defences, brigandine or breastplate, would be worn over the top of a mail shirt. So in a sense, kind of where you could kind of think of the mail shirt as the base layer, the fundamental armour that a typical soldier might wear. Sometimes it was a padded jack rather than a mail shirt, it has to be said, but mail shirts have been around obviously, well, way back into the Roman era, but right the way through the medieval period. And sometimes, even in the 15th and 16th centuries, we see some common soldiers just wearing a mail shirt without either of the brigandine or the breastplate over the top. So just to set some context here, we're looking primarily at common soldiers. What do I mean by that? I mean people that don't own land. Maybe sometimes they might have a small holding, I guess. They could be a kind of yeoman farmer, but for the most part, they're not what you would commonly think of as knights or even as men-at-arms. They're your typical soldiers who are going to be, generally speaking, either using missile weapons, primarily bows, crossbows, and early firearms, or they're going to be using long pole weapons such as pikes, spears, halberds, bills, things like this. Now, when we're talking about common soldiers like this, most people, I think, would think of the brigandine as, for the 15th and 16th centuries, being a really standard piece of gear. And indeed, it was pretty damned common. However, it wasn't common in all places. So the brigandine developed from the coat of plates, which was the precursor to the cuirass in the 14th century. So in the middle of the 14th century, we can essentially say that the coat of plates was diverging into two directions, into having larger and larger plates and eventually becoming the breastplate and the kind of overlapping lames and skirt and back plates that go with that via the corazina. And in the other direction, it was moving into having smaller and smaller plates, which obviously leads us to the brigandine. Is it possible that lamellar armour from the east and the south played a part in that development as well? Possibly. Obviously there were people on the fringes of what we now call Europe who were using lamellar armour, and that may have had an influence on people thinking about using smaller plates for protection as well. Absolutely. However, fundamentally, we end up with the armour based around a breastplate being the primary frontal piece of your defence, or we end up with lots of small plates. Now, interestingly, the brigandine really caught on big time in the western part of Europe particularly. So England, well, the British Isles as a whole, England and Scotland and Wales, also the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain and Portugal, also all of France, also all of Italy, but there's this really weird aspect of the study of arms and armour which kind of gets skirted around because we don't have a good explanation for it, and that is, why did the brigandine never really catch on in Germany. Now, what's now Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire, which also included part of what's now Poland, what's now the Czech Republic, and at various points even the northern part of Italy as well, above the Papal States. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to refer to the modern national borders because they actually correlate quite well with the presence or lack of presence of the brigandines. So interestingly, we see brigandines, absolutely tons of them in France. We have records about brigandine makers. We even know that brigandines were made to various different qualities for proof against bows or crossbows. So they could be very protective. We'll come back to that point in a second. So France, tons of brigandines. Italy, northern Italy, tons of brigandines. They appear in loads of the art of the whole of the 15th century. So we know loads about the presence of the brigandine and the styles, particular patterns of the rivets and the decoration and the plates and everything else in northern Italy. And yet, weirdly, when we get to Switzerland, Austria and Germany, by modern borders, there's kind of no brigandine. It's like, where have the brigandines gone? Why weren't they using brigandines? Instead, what we see are various forms of breastplate. Now, this is a style of breastplate based on the Coburg one, so early 15th century. So this is something like you might see around the year 1400, okay, or Battle of Shrewsbury, something like that. But throughout the 15th century, we see both standalone breastplates like this early 15th century variety, and we also see infantry wearing breastplates which have a few lames, like a few skirt lames. It's not really a skirt actually, because this, if I just put this over myself, this actually protects the upper part of the torso and leaves your belly actually sticking out at the bottom, which the brigandine doesn't. We'll come to that in a second. So if you want to protect what's below this or behind this with this kind of protection, you need to be wearing a mail shirt at least, or a very multi-layered jack, or you need to have other plates in the form of a skirt fold. So the big question and the big elephant in the room, and the one which I don't have a straightforward answer to at all, is why do we have brigandine all over England, France, the Iberian Peninsula and Italy? And then we've got breastplates and cuirasses, even just for common soldiers, in what's now Germany, Austria and Switzerland. We don't really know. One of the first things you start to do is you start to think about, well, the patterns of warfare. Who were they fighting? What weapons were being used? Okay, so we could say that within what's now Germany and Bohemia and Switzerland and Austria, there was perhaps a slightly bigger degree of use of firearms early on. I don't see how that would particularly relate to this question. One other aspect which I think possibly does is the presence of high rate of fire. I don't have a better expression because obviously there's no fire involved. That's a firearms expression. I know that before you comment down below. But high rate of fire bows and longbows. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, so quite famously, there was a little old thing called the 100 Years' War, but that also spilled over into what's now Spain and Portugal. It also spilled over into Italy, with the effect that there were a lot of missile troops being deployed by the English and anywhere the English were and against the English. So if we go to France and England and indeed northern Italy and indeed at various points Spain and Portugal, we see huge numbers of arrows and bolts being shot around. Is it possible that that wasn't the case in Germany, Switzerland and Austria, or rather that the proportion of missile troops to hand-to-hand troops was different? This is an interesting theory which needs to be looked into more deeply, and I'm not going to make any great definitive assertions about this because it's only a theory. However, an interesting thing happened at the end of the Wars of the Roses. In 1487, there was something called the Battle of Stoke, also known as the Battle of Stoke Field, where a large mixed force of revival kind of Yorkists turned up to fight Henry VII's Lancastrian army, Tudor army, in fact, by that point. And it got completely demolished. And interestingly, it mostly got shot to pieces by longbow arrows. And this was a mixed German and Swiss force, okay, under a guy called Martin Schwarz, who was a very famous and very successful early, like proto-Landsknecht mercenary commander. Is that to do with the armour? Is it that a bunch of Germans turned up with their, not like this, but a later version of this, with their indigenous German armour, used to being deployed in the wars in Switzerland and Austria and Germany and Prussia and Bohemia, turned up in England and got shot to pieces by longbowmen? Does that tell us something? Maybe. I don't know. I'm pulling at a lot of straws here. You might know other information, you might have other theories, and I'd be very interested to see that down below. So, it is possible, I might even say likely, that the armour evolves in an area to deal with the opponents who you happen to be fighting. We see this in the Roman period, we see this amongst the Greeks, the Egyptians, everybody. Throughout history, this is normal. Even World War II with tanks. You develop the armour because of who you're fighting. Now, we'll bring that back to the brigandine. That is particularly supported by the presence of the brigandine, because when we look at the French kind of laws, essentially, on brigandine makers, so not just French as well, all the way up to Flanders as well, when we look at the written sources for brigandines, they seem really, really occupied by whether they'll stop an arrow. Now, when you consider that we're talking about 15th century France, and it's not just the English using longbows, and the English sometimes use crossbows, particularly in siege as well, but of course the French are using crossbows en masse, but they also are using archers, and that's maybe not widely known, but the French also deployed longbowmen. And most famously, the Brigandines, who at the time controlled most of Flanders, also had huge numbers of longbowmen copied from the English. They even copied the wooden stakes and the whole thing. And they had English longbowmen mercenaries as well. And that was also true in Prussia and at a certain point, but it was also true in Spain and northern Italy. And obviously in northern Italy, the English free companies, who also had French members as well, had operated. So it's interesting to me. And if we looked at arrows versus armour 3 or 4, which was the most recent one, but anyway, looking at 3 it was, wasn't it? Looking at testing of the brigandine, then indeed the brigandine stood up very well against arrows. Now, that's not to say that breastplates don't stand up well against arrows, but they have a deficiency. So very briefly, because this isn't a video necessarily about breastplate versus brigandine, we could do that as a separate video. I think I probably dealt with it in the past. These are better, or more comfortable, should we say, at taking heavy impacts from things like lances or poleaxes. There's no question amongst all the people I know who joust and who use poleaxes, if you're engaged in poleaxe fighting or jousting, you would rather have a breastplate on, because it acts like a bridge over the torso, rather than a brigandine. Yes, a brigandine can stop an arrow, but an arrow is a light, fast-moving object. Stopping a heavier, more solid, slower-moving object, then the more solid breastplate is definitely more pleasant. But this has a weakness. Now, I alluded to this before when I mentioned this only really protects the upper part of the body. It leaves the lower parts somewhat exposed, and it leaves the back completely exposed. Now, you might think, well, a full cuirass like my full armour on a knight, yes, that covers everything. It has a long skirt, it has a back plate or series of plates on the back. So yeah, you're protected all around, but a common breastplate or cuirass for something like a halberdier or a pikeman in Germany or Switzerland doesn't. It only has a plate protecting pretty much the breast, and it leaves your nether regions uncovered, and it leaves your back uncovered. Now, if you are fighting in predominantly pike or halberd combat, that might be good enough, because you've got a helmet, you've got a breastplate, good, your torso's protected. This, if you've got the steel to make it with, is actually far quicker and easier to make than a brigandine is. A brigandine is more time consuming to make and requires more different trades and materials involvement. This is just one bit of iron. A brigandine has the material, the rivets, all sorts of stuff mixed in with it. So it's potentially more complicated and more expensive to make. So, if you're engaged in pike combat and halberd combat and you don't have lots of longbow arrows being shot at you, then maybe the cuirass does the job. The cuirass over the top of the mail shirt, perfectly good, no criticism. When you turn up in 1487 to the Battle of Stoke Field, maybe it won't go so well when you get shot at from different directions by longbow arrows because you've got too many gaps. One of the great things about the brigandine, you may have noticed, it is not dissimilar to a modern flak jacket or body armour. It protects all sides, back, front. It is obviously flexible, so you've got more flexibility in it, but it's also relatively, or they can be relatively long. Longer than most of the cuirasses or breastplates that we see worn by Swiss, Austrian, German pikemen and halberdiers. Anyway, what do you think about my theory? And do you think there are potentially other reasons why the brigandine was so popular in France, Italy, England and the Iberian Peninsula, and why the breastplate or frontal cuirass was so popular in the German lands? I don't know. This is the only thing I can think of at the moment is it's got something to do with the opponents they were fighting against, and that the Battle of Stoke Field 1487 might hold the key. What do you think? I will throw it out there to you now. Get posting your theories down below. As always, thanks for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.